Get away.
Okay, thank you, Larry, and for Alex. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Howie Lind, the president of ISOA. Welcome to the new ISOA webinar series as we soldier on through this current environment caused by the coronavirus, also known as COVID-19. We're planning to hold these webinars twice a week for the foreseeable future on relevant issues to your company and to your industry. Please let me know particular topics of interest to you. Appropriately, our first topic today is on the coronavirus and how it is impacting your business. We'll hear from experts who will be introduced in a moment all right, can't control my phone ringing here. We'll hear from experts who will be introduced in a moment from the medical company International SOS and the law firm of Miller Chevalier Chartered. We thank both International SOS and Miller Chevalier for their leadership on this critical issue. I'll now introduce Alex Sarria from Miller Chevalier, who will be moderator for this webinar. Alex Sarria is an experienced litigator and counselor with wide-ranging expertise in government contracts law. He represents government contractors in complex contract disputes with federal and state governments, bid protests, prime sub-disputes, and in mass tort lawsuits arising out of military operations, national security programs, and environmental remediation projects. Alex, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Howie, and thank you, everybody, for joining. Hopefully our technology here holds up. We'll jump right into it, and I'll introduce today's speakers. So today we're very, very lucky to be joined by Dr. Myles Druckman. Dr. Druckman is Group Medical Director at International SOS and is a well-known author, media resource, and thought leader in the international corporate health space. He works on workforce risk management and global health security issues. He's been with International SOS for more than 20 years, spending 10 years of that time working in Russia and in China. Dr. Druckman is now based in Los Angeles, where he develops new technologies and services as part of his health innovation role. He provides guidance and support to North American-based organizations on managing global health risks. He's also co-chairman of the nonprofit International Corporate Health Leadership Council and is an alumni of the World Economic Forum's Global Leaders of Tomorrow Network. So we're very lucky to have Dr. Druckman join us today. Along with Dr. Druckman, I've got three of my colleagues who are experts in different areas of interest during this whole crisis situation. Erin Sweeney is a partner here at Miller Chevalier. She advises on all facets of healthcare, including the Affordable Care Act, health privacy under the HIPAA laws, welfare benefits claims, health insurance continuation under the COBRA law, and U.S. Department of Labor audits and investigations. And she also advises on employee benefit plan administration. Erin counsels and represents parties in litigation regarding their fiduciary obligations, including plan investments, fee disclosure, and prohibited transactions and exemptions. Joining us also is my partner, Preston Pugh, who's an experienced trial lawyer. He represents employers and is a member of the firm's executive committee. Preston's been recognized by the Legal 500 for corporate investigations, and he is trained as both a federal prosecutor and a labor and employment lawyer. He represents corporations and large institutions in risk avoidance and mitigation investigations and litigation. He's defended corporate employers, serving as the lead in several employment cases that were tried before juries, including in matters of discrimination, ADA, and FMLA cases. He's also defended employers in OSHA workplace dawn raids. And then finally, my partner, Jorge Castro, who has 15 years of experience in practicing tax law, including a decade of high-level government experience working on domestic and international tax issues at the IRS and U.S. Congress. His practice focuses on tax policy, regulatory, and compliance matters. He also has extensive experience working closely with foreign governments from all regions on a variety of tax and global economic issues. So let's apologize 1 second here. All right. So here's an overview of today's discussion. So we'll start out with a global update on COVID-19 provided by Dr. Druckman, of course, and then we will take turn into each of these areas of the law and business that our firm is seeing companies, government contractors in particular, start to deal with issues as a result of the global outbreak. We selected these areas because we recognize that the folks on this call are wearing many different hats at the moment. And so we figured these areas might be of particular interest, but certainly if there are other areas of interest and questions, you can follow up either through the chat function here or via email afterwards. We are a bit pressed for time here. We want to be respectful of everyone's time, so we'll move quick through each of these areas. But again, if there's follow-up, we're happy to field those questions after the webinar, either through ISOA or directly with our email addresses that are posted in the presentation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Druckman, who's going to give us an update on the situation across the globe, and then also walk us through strategies for limiting the impact of the coronavirus outbreak on your companies.
Great. Thanks very much, everyone. And, it is a bit of a challenging time for everyone around the world. You can see the map of the world pretty much. If it's not all colored, it will be all colored pretty soon. And I think one of the key first messages is, what does a pandemic mean besides being a very scary word? A pandemic ultimately means it's going to go ultimately everywhere in the world. So it's not a question of if it will, it's just a question of when. And I think, so what that means is that all of us, if you're not colored green on that map, every location in the world needs to be considering when this does come to my community, what do we need to do to mitigate that and to try to limit the impact to our people and to our communities. And while we're looking at the whole world there, this outbreak really is local. It's all about kind of where you are and what your local capabilities are to mitigate that. And you also need to think about this as the concept of a wave. You've seen a lot of news recently about, these waves of illness going through, and the concept of flattening the wave. Really what we're trying to do here, and what the world community is trying to do, is try to really stop or mitigate that wave. And then if it is going to come in, how do we reduce the impact in our community? And every community has their own capabilities to deal with this. And typically, if you're working in an underserviced area with limited medical and healthcare infrastructure, you don't have a lot of surge capacity if a lot of people get sick all at once. And so I think the areas, unfortunately, where this could have the greatest impact and be most challenging are in, developing countries and underserviced areas. Because the functionality of everybody, I think someone's off mute. The functionality of being able to actively respond and be able to contain the outbreak is going to be very challenging. And I don't know if there's another slide after this one. I think there might be one more here, just giving you a list. There we go. Okay. So what I thought I would do is just show you what you may expect, or what we have seen in the world community, what we've seen governments do, and what we think that organizations can do. So all of these interventions we're going to be talking about are what are called non-pharmaceutical interventions. You may see the word NPI. And it's a very fancy word for all of the things that you can do to try to mitigate and reduce the risk to the community and to your workforce. So what we've seen initially in China, and now we're seeing in many parts of the world, is when those first cases occurred and those travelers came into certain communities, there's the concept of containment. So containment means we want to identify those first people coming in. We want to try to, like you say, ring them off and contain it so that the virus cannot spread beyond those first contacts of people. So you're seeing quite aggressive interventions, and quite frankly, it's been successful. If you look at what happened in Singapore, if you look at what happened in certain cities in China, where they were able to rapidly identify and isolate people who are ill, quarantine all of their contacts, keep them away from everybody else, and then try to stop the whole virus from spreading into the local community. So that's called containment. And it may or may not be successful based on how fast and effective that containment is, and obviously how aggressive it is. And there's a high degree of probability that things will break out of containment, and then it will go into the community. And if it goes into the community, it's called what we call community transmission. And this means that you're now looking at other types of strategies as well. This is what we've talked about. You've seen with social distancing, everyone needs to keep 6 feet away from each other. You're washing your hands all the time. You're protecting yourself from your cough. If anyone's sick, you're isolating them in their separate room. All of those types of interventions. You're not having meetings. You're closing public spaces. You're closing restaurants and bars like we've seen in the U.S. All of these things are a mitigation strategy to minimize the number of people that are impacted and ultimately slow down the rise of the cases. So you can imagine that if you're going to have 100 people getting sick, you want 100 people getting sick over 4 months with 3 to 4 people getting sick each day. What you don't want is 100 people getting sick on day one and showing up in your emergency room and you're not able to cope with it. So the purpose is to kind of drag those cases out. So a successful strategy means that we're going through this for a longer period of time, but hopefully with a situation where our society and our community can cope with it effectively. So what does this mean for organizations? Well, organizations can do a lot of the things that the public health authorities are doing. We might call them a little bit different things, but it's all about now, how do you protect your workplace? How do you ensure that you can mitigate, the spread of the virus in your community, which is your workplace? And this concept of zoning is what we saw done during Ebola, and it's quite practical too for this COVID-19 outbreak. Basically, what you're looking at is screening people when they come in. So you don't want anyone that's ill or has had a close contact coming into the workplace. Once they're in the workplace, you want them to keep their social distance, which is 6 feet. So you space out all their workstations. Their cleaning is really important. Regular hand washing, cleaning of your workstations. And then, of course, if anyone does develop symptoms at work, there's a procedure to isolate them and either get them home or get them to the nearest medical facility, whatever your community is recommending to do. So those are the procedures that we're seeing a lot of organizations put in place. And again, every company, every business is different, how much they have to interface with the local public community, how much they interface with each other, what operations are business critical. So we're seeing a lot of people, like many of us are today, probably working from home. So you want to minimize the people that have to come to work. If they do have to come to work, are they essential to be at work? If they are essential to be at work, how can we minimize their exposure? Well, we can space them out so they come to work at staggered hours, so no one's showing up in the lobby at the same time. They each have their set time they come through. They're working, as I say, with that social distance amongst each other. And you also might have areas in the workplace that are very sensitive, business critical areas. So for example, at International SOS, we have call centers that need to be up 24/7. They're supporting people all the time. So no one is allowed into the call center unless they absolutely have to be there for a business critical perspective. So there's no visitors. There's only people that need to be there that are in there, and they're screened before they go in. So that whole area of zoning is the kind of things that organizations are putting in place today. And the final thing I'll say before I hand off here is that this will end. These waves will be over. And not everyone's going to be affected at the same time. So China was affected first. Some of those places are getting near recovery, which means they're almost getting back to normal. And probably within the next couple months, they will be definitely back to normal. Whereas other places haven't even been impacted yet, and they might be impacted later. So what organizations need to be looking at is how do they manage their operations so that the areas that have recovered start doing, some of the work for the places that are still in the midst of the crisis. And so that you can ultimately be efficient in how you get back to normal functioning. Your employees are comfortable to come back to work. They're able to do the work efficiently. They're in a safe environment. That's part of the whole recovery strategy. So that's the thing as well that we're starting to see companies already start to look at, because as I say, this will not last forever. It will probably last a number of months, but it ultimately will be over. So with that, I'm sure there may be additional questions, but I just wanted to highlight, kind of very high level strategically what organizations are doing, and also what the world community is doing as well.
Thank you, Dr. Druckman. So with that, we'll sort of pivot here. Recognizing first and foremost, this is a health crisis, health and safety crisis. Certainly, that doesn't mean that there aren't business and legal impacts that flow out from that, and we are, at least in our line of work, starting to see that occur with more frequency. So that's what the next couple of sections we're going to focus on, is a couple of areas where we're seeing the most business impacts. And the very first area we'll start with is employee benefits. So I'll turn it over to Erin Sweeney.
Thank you. So in the employee benefits arena, what we're really seeing is a sudden need to address and evaluate how healthcare is provided to our employees. And again, this, as alluded to, this is a very fluid and a fluctuating area, but one of the areas that has been paramount, at least, and this is in the United States, is, what I'm calling testing 1, 2, 3. Like, how do we get the testing? How do we manage the testing? What do we need to do? And so really what we've seen in this area is we've been working with a lot of clients who are bringing us their health plan documents and having us take a look at them to see what kind of flexibility they can offer, what guidance we might expect from our regulators. And right front and center, one of the issues is, well, what about my employees who have they have high deductible health plans? Like, they have to satisfy a certain deductible before they can even have access to the plan. If I give them or let them have access to testing, is that going to blow up my high deductible health plan? And so the good news on that front is what we have heard from the IRS is that any treatment or testing that is received for coronavirus is actually able to be covered by the health plan without satisfying that large deductible. And so we've received that relief from our regulators. What we don't yet have is some other guidance on what we might be able to use the high deductible health plan, the HSA. We sort of jumping down to the next item here, I'm going to go back up a little bit on testing, but one of the areas while we're talking about HSA, high deductible health plans, that we've been asked about is it possible to get some comfort or some relief from the IRS on preventative access to masks, let's say, or even hand sanitizer, or if you could buy it, right? or any kind of prophylactic antibiotics, prophylactic medications for asymptomatic individuals. I mean, we've heard a lot that asymptomatic individuals can be spreading the illness, but the question is, what if anything, can the plans be utilized for to provide preventive care? And other concerns that again, people are looking to their plan documents and taking a look to see if they can provide, can they provide additional discretion? Is there any way to read the language of the plan so that they can provide more coverage or make something fall under like a different category? And so we've been working with a lot of clients on that. I will say that some of the help that we've received on the testing front from HHS is to make it clear that Medicare Advantage can actually reduce or waive any cost sharing for coronavirus treatment and testing. And what HHS has indicated to us is that that can be done without violating the anti-kickback statutes. And so that's welcome relief. But we've also had questions, and this goes to whether or not your health plan can cover it. What about the drive-by testing? Is that covered? How can you make that fit? Because we've seen in other countries that the ability to set up drive-by sites where people don't get out of their car, it reduces the infection level and it also increases the testing out in the population. So if we could turn to the next slide. And another area that, where there's been a lot of creativity and need from employers, and we've been providing counseling on, is there have been some third-party administrators, which, health insurance providers, that have gone ahead and created a telehealth benefit. And what they did, and it was last week where the third-party administrator started doing this, is they would say, we're going to provide telehealth availability to all of your employees, regardless of whether they're on the health plan. And so any employee who wants to have telehealth benefits will make that available. And some of the third-party administrators even said, well, if we don't hear back from you in 24 hours, you have this. And then the employer is going to pay on a per-use basis. And, some of the questions that we're getting in that area is, okay, well, this is a snap-on benefit. It's not for the people under the health plan. So what about the ACA? It doesn't have minimum essential coverage. And so we've been working with clients on that. How do you provide this benefit, keep everybody safe in a time of true emergency, and address the issues associated with Affordable Care Act? The next bullet point talks about particular plan provisions, and we've been helping clients go through and identify plan provisions, such as the one that I've identified here. As some plans require that in order to receive coverage under the plan, that an individual has to travel to a center of excellence. For example, one plan that I've been looking at, it says that all total joint replacement surgery has to be completed in Washington State. Well, if you're watching the waves, as we're talking about, the infection level in Washington State is a high bubble. And so the question is, what are we doing? How can we fix our plans? How can we be nimble and respond to these kinds of issues? The last bullet point that I'll mention, because I know there's a lot of people with a lot of different areas that we're just going to touch on here today, is how to manage quarantine. And as Dr. Druckman indicated, I mean, at this point, the containment strategy, at least in the United States, we're beyond that. And so initially we had a lot of issues that we were working with clients about what to do about my employees who may have been on one of the cruise ships who were then at one of the Air Force bases. How do we coordinate benefits? How do we, who has to pay for the medicine? Does the government pay for that? Does the plan pay for that? But I would also note that we still have quarantine in a number of states. There are places where for homeless people, there are hotels or other places that are being managed by the states. And so we're dealing with those issues, in the trenches on how to manage that. I will say that, one of the issues that we have seen some relief from Medicare in any event is on the question of hospital settings, which is, as the question is posed here, what about a patient who no longer meets the definition of acute patient care, but they can't be released because they're required to be in the hospital for quarantine? And And here we've actually had Medicare say that it's okay if they don't meet the definition for acute patient care, they can still stay in the facility that they're in under quarantine. Of course, they have access to a private room, even if their plan didn't provide it, and they won't be charged an additional copay. So what we're seeing is a combination of overarching Medicare and regulator assistance and guidance. But in addition to that, we're digging down, employers are digging down into the plans themselves to see whether or not that they can create any flexibility or have any discretion. And so those are the kinds of employee benefits issues that we're seeing.
Thank you, Erin. So turning to the government contracts front here, the basic challenge here is that we're really seeing here is the movement of people and supply. So, disruption of supply chains, labor markets, and travel, and the secondary effects that is having on contract performance. And so you're seeing challenges with delay in performing contract obligations, increased costs of performance associated with workarounds that need to be put in place or that are directed by the government. And then in some cases, disputes between contractors, prime contractors and their government customers, and prime contractors or lower tier contractors with their subcontractors and suppliers. And so the challenges here in this space really are all up and down the contracting chain. It's not just for prime contractors. We're certainly seeing, middle tier and lower tier subcontractors and suppliers obviously be impacted by this. The real, two main areas where, you're starting to see challenges emerge are primarily the labor impacts and the impacts on sources of supply. And so for a lot of the folks on this call who are providing services to the U.S. government overseas, really the challenges are associated with the movement of personnel, the ability to have folks travel in and out of country or to particular locations. You're also seeing impacts with scheduling. So scheduling rotations. A lot of folks have labor forces that are on 2-week or month-long rotations where they're on for a couple of weeks, then they're off for a couple of weeks. And that's presenting challenges for contractors in theater. Are they required to keep those folks on? If they keep them on, but they're not actually working, how do they pay them? And how are they dealing with the costs of keeping them on and ready to perform if they are sort of set aside at the ready? Another big challenge here is how to work through issues that come up with local or third country national labor, right? We see that in theaters such as Iraq and Afghanistan, but also other places in the MENA region where there is a heavy reliance on third country national labor or local labor. And so managing with your customers, your military customers or your diplomatic customers, how those folks are going to be allowed onto base or into an area where they're actually performing work, health screenings for those folks, and how you're managing the same question of idle time if they're not allowed to work. One big thing here that is driving the questions on labor are the adjustments that the military itself and the diplomatic missions themselves are making to their personnel. So, just this week we saw the Department of Defense issue a freeze on domestic travel for all non-essential DoD personnel. There are a number of other exceptions to that rule, such as health and medical emergencies. But query whether overseas we are going to start seeing the same type of restrictions on the movement of personnel being dictated by the government. And then, the question then is sort of the second level of effects that it will have on the performance of your contracts and the management of your subcontractors and suppliers, if that's the case. In terms of, sources of supply, there are a lot of folks on this phone whose primary business is providing services. But for those of you who are, in the transportation business or the logistics business, or even building systems, weapon systems for the United States, it should come as no surprise that there are some challenges here in terms of supplies from certain countries, the ability to move those supplies across the country or across the world into certain regions, and the challenges that we have at this moment, certainly in identifying alternative sources of supply. Just to reiterate here, I think one of the biggest observations is probably the most obvious, which is it's a fluid situation, and so in many cases, the companies that are performing work for the government, many of them will be asked to speed up their performance, to double down, add resources because they are performing, in some cases, mission essential services or providing mission essential supplies to the United States. In many cases abroad, but then in other cases, contractors will be asked to slow down their performance or even stop it entirely. And so, that's sort of the challenge, is figuring out at any given moment which of those categories you fall into, and recognizing that as this situation develops, particularly for companies that are performing abroad, at one moment you may not necessarily be in full-on work mode, where the government is asking you to perform and perform quickly, but you may be asked to ramp up very quickly and add resources as necessary. In terms of what to look out for, I think the first bullet here is perhaps obvious to many of the compliance and the legal folks on the phone, but it pays, I think, to sort of remind ourselves how this situation fits into the normal construct of government contracting. So, be on the lookout for formal notices, emails, written letters from your customers, asking you to either cure performance delays or deficiencies that certainly, for the folks who work in this space and a lot, know that can sometimes be the precursor to a termination of your contract. And so that's a particularly important notice to keep an eye out on. The other thing there is that if you get a cure notice that has, is suggesting that perhaps your company is not performing quickly enough or is not performing in accordance with the terms and conditions of its contract. One of the big things that's going on right now is whether or not the COVID-19 outbreak will be viewed as an excusable delay for late performance, and certainly understanding how the excusable delay provisions in your contract or in general in the FAR work is something that's important to remind ourselves of. Other notices, suspensions of work, stop work notices, on stop work, particularly for the services companies in the room, the government can issue a stop work notice directing your company to cease performance, initially up to a total of 90 days. They can later extend it by agreement of the parties. But understanding, what your obligations are during that time, during a stop work, the standard clause there requires you to, quote unquote, take reasonable measures to mitigate the cost to the government during that stop work period. Query what that means, in a situation as dynamic as this one, where if the stop work is suddenly lifted or lifted quickly, the company needs to be poised to continue its performance as it is obligated to do under government contracts. Keeping an eye out for changes, so bilateral and unilateral modifications to your contract, either in the supplies or services that the government's asking you to provide, the schedule, so the timing of your performance, and then also your method of performance. Those notices, may start to come down the pike rather quickly. Understanding the implications of a bilateral modification versus a unilateral modification is also quite important. And, in addition to those formal changes, understanding that the government's actions or its direction can also result in what's known as a constructive change. So you may not get a letter in the mail or via email indicating that the government wants to modify your contract, but something the government asks you to do, or directs you to do that may change the scope or nature of your contract and cause you to incur increased costs or potentially push your performance out in terms of timing and your ability to actually meet the existing timeframes in your contract. The last thing I'll mention here is, there are a number of companies, certainly there are companies on the phone here who may already be performing, but may soon also be asked to perform work that falls into a category known as unusually hazardous risk. And so, keep an eye out for contract awards or contract modifications where the government is asking your company to perform services that may expose you to liability for injuries to other people. Examples of that where we've seen the U.S. government indemnify contractors include building camps during the Ebola crisis. If you are asked to transport or conduct medical evacuations of folks who may be infected or sick, or do other sort of medical services for those individuals, that may actually qualify for indemnification under Public Law 85804, meaning the United States would indemnify the company for liabilities over and above available insurance. So how do we prepare here? So, the best piece of advice that I got as a baby lawyer was always read the contract. And I know that seems somewhat trite, but here, we are dealing with folks who are used to leaning forward into their obligations to the government and are used to working in fluid situations, dynamic environments. And often we don't take the time to take a step back and look at what our contract obligations are besides what's in the statement of work, but also really understanding the terms and conditions that apply to different situations that might materialize during performance. I won't go through each and every one of these clauses. Certainly that could take quite a bit of time, but here what we have done is list the most common federal acquisition regulation clauses that tend to be incorporated into U.S. government contracts and that will govern different situations like the ones that I mentioned earlier. So excusable delay, changes, suspension or stop work, terminations as well. And I think, just in looking at these clauses, understand, okay, not only what clauses are included in your contract, but what is missing, right? If there's a contract clause that would provide you relief from late performance as an excusable delay by virtue of an epidemic or an act of God that would sort of fall into what we all think of traditionally as a force majeure event, that contract clause, if it is mandatory or it's advisable to be included in your contract, but it's not there, now is the time to take a look and make sure that it is there. And if it's not, to engage with your customer to try to make sure that it's included. How might these clauses come into play? I think that's another thing to consider. So, big picture, each of these clauses, certainly when something goes wrong during performance, the U.S. government is giving the contractor instructions. For example, during a stop work period or in a cure notice, the United States is indicating what it wants the contractor to do, what it doesn't want a contractor to do. If it's issuing a termination for convenience, there are a number of steps that need to be taken before a contractor can submit a termination settlement proposal to the government and recover its costs. So all of these clauses, it's important to try to refresh and remind ourselves as to what directions they include, what instructions they might include if the government were to invoke them in a situation where there's a performance interruption. And then understanding, I think, ultimately what relief is available under each of these clauses in terms of cost, the ability to recover increased costs of performance, or to get schedule extensions, more time to perform. That certainly is quite important. And then a number of these clauses have timing requirements, right? So, for example, under most of the changes clauses, if the government makes a change to your contract, services, schedule, method of performance, generally the rule is that you have 30 days to assert your right to recover or for more time to perform. And so keeping in mind that there are some time frames that may limit your ability to recover later on. The last thing I'll mention here is in the miscellaneous category, don't forget special H clauses. A lot of companies who are starting to take a look at their contracts may focus on the FAR clauses, but the special H clauses, as many of the folks on the call know, can be just as important. It's where the government might lay out special requirements that apply either to overseas contracts or to a locality. So keeping in mind, local laws and other ordinances from the military and from the Department of Defense is equally important here. So continuing on how to prepare, the big picture approach here that many in our firm have been advising on is really to take a risk-based approach to planning around things that could potentially go wrong during performance as a result of the outbreak. And so a lot of companies have adopted a risk-based planning approach. That means categorizing your risks either in a risk matrix or in other ways that make decision making easier for the folks above who are obligated or are responsible for making those decisions. So categorizing risk is either high probability, high impact, low probability, high impact, and so on and so forth. And then developing your workarounds based on how you are categorizing those risks. So if you think that there's a decent chance that you may experience a labor shortage or a labor interruption because of rules that might be implemented around the availability of third country nationals, not only categorizing that risk, but also exploring alternate sources of labor, or creating labor contingency plans to try to mitigate that risk. And then lastly, prioritizing around that risk, right? There are going to be lots of potential issues, certainly that can come up here in a situation like this, but making sure that you're thinking in terms of not only the immediate challenges to the business or challenges to performance, but also prioritizing resources around the ones that are most existential, the ones that are likely to or most likely to cause potential problems. The last thing I'll mention here is, again, another one that may seem obvious, but is often overlooked when you're trying to meet your contract obligations. But that's to engage with your customers, whether we're talking about a U.S. government customer, we're talking about a higher tier contractor. That line of communication is going to be extremely vital in a situation where we're seeing things change from day to day. It's good hygiene here, pardon the pun, to, provide early notice of potential issues while at the same time providing assurance of your continued performance. So one of the things that, companies can fall into a trap on and maybe run into some issues is to identify for their customers all of the problems that they have, but without really offering up workarounds or potential ways to mitigate the impacts of the problems. That sometimes leads the government or a customer to really question whether you have the ability to perform. And so you want to make sure that you're not only offering up the issues and flagging them for your customers, but also offering up potential solutions. The other one here I mentioned is to follow U.S. Instructions in termination notices, stop work orders, for example, but also to give clear instructions to your subcontractors and to your suppliers. That's equally important here. And if you look at many of the FAR clauses that I mentioned in the previous slide, that's a big component that's often overlooked. It's a requirement for any contractor who's terminated for convenience, for example, to then turn around and take steps to engage with their lower tier suppliers and subcontractors to make sure ultimately that the government is not incurring more costs than it needs to. And then the last thing I'll mention here again is just I think good business practice is to document your communications, actions taken by the government, and lastly, your increased costs. A lot of the things that happen in the coming weeks and months under your contract may start to seem like business as usual because of the situation that we find ourselves in, but it's important to always keep in mind how it differs from the baseline of performance that's actually set out in your contract. And documenting the costs, tracking those costs, making sure that you are keeping, good enough documentation so that when the time does come to seek relief from your customer, if that's what your company decides to do, that you can actually back up your request for either additional money or additional time under your contracts. So with that, I'll turn it over to Preston to talk a little bit about employment and crisis management.
Thank you, Alex. Okay, good. Thank you, Alex. So, listening to what we've discussed so far, right? There's a lot of information that all of you on the call are receiving. Frankly, it causes a lot of anxiety. It causes anxiety for you as an employer, but it causes a lot of anxiety for your employees as well, who frankly have less control in the situation than employers do. We are in very much what is a crisis, and sometimes that word is overused. But in this case, it very much is a crisis. Recall again that a crisis is an event that has the potential to fundamentally change how you do business, and for some businesses, hopefully none on this call, whether they can do business at all. A crisis also includes situations that can fundamentally disrupt your business's relationships with its stakeholders, both internal and external. And what we're going to focus on for the next few minutes when it comes to your employees is your relationships with your internal stakeholders, or in this case, as I said, your employees. We know that we can't possibly cover all of your concerns. But as you've heard throughout the day so far, we are here for you. When it comes to employment, we've stood by you in some of the most difficult times, be it a whistleblower claim that with high exposure on the end of it, or a heated trial where one of your employees is saying you did something wrong, or even in a difficult EEOC or OSHA investigation. When we look at this, what we're in right now, this is different. Okay, and your employees feel it as well. When you approach this from an employment standpoint, what you have are two competing perspectives, so to speak. On one hand, as an employer, you have an obligation to provide a safe workplace for your employees, and we'll talk about what that means. On the other hand, you also have an obligation to respect your individual employees' rights. What does that mean in this situation like this? While this part is about how to go about answering questions, how about going through the maze, so to speak, of employment issues that can come up. What's really required here is a multidisciplinary approach, bringing together your company's leadership, your HR leader, be it a CHRO or chief people officer, legal, in most cases, your general counsel, and in some cases outside counsel. And depending on how large you are, you may need someone to help you message some of the decisions that you're making effectively, so that your employees understand where you're coming from. In managing this crisis, employers who are based in this country are dealing with different agencies. One of them is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, right? And that's the one that requires you to provide a safe workplace for your employees, right? You have to make sure that you're not knowingly putting your employees in harm's way. On the other hand, your individual employees have rights under the Family Medical Leave Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and of course under your own policies that pertain to what your leave, pertain to the leave that you'll provide them. We can go to the next slide. So if we start to walk this maze with you, what we want to do is cover some of the bigger questions that we've come across since this started. First question: what if your employees travel for business? Now, the answer to that question, or maybe the premise of that question, was probably a little different a couple of weeks ago than it is today, given that travel has decreased for many. But the reality is it has not stopped for everybody. Maybe it will, but it hasn't yet. You have to first know where your employees are not allowed to travel. And again, you talk about a dynamic field. The travel ban, which is essentially a collection of 4 different bans from the president, applies to a number of places: China, Hong Kong, Macau, Iran, a large part of Europe, as well as UK and Ireland. And that you know that if you have employees who for some reason would have had to go to those areas, it's something you probably want to stay away from if you can as an employer. And you certainly don't want to send them there either. The OSHA general duty clause, again, keeping your employees out of harm's way, tells you that for a serious violation of that clause, it's $7,000, and for willful and repeat violations, it can be up to $70,000. Right? We're talking about per violation, per individual violation. Now, on the other hand, what if your employees want to travel for personal reasons? We've run across a situation where an employee, had this dream vacation that they had really thought about and planned for quite some time, and giving it up was just more than they were willing to do. The reality here is that your rights are murky. You know that you can't keep any employee from traveling on their own dime, on their own time. However, you do not have to let them back into the workplace. And there are situations where employers, in anticipation of a situation where an employee was going to take a personal trip to an area that was affected, and in this case, it was affected by something other than the current illness. It was affected by Ebola. The employer in that situation had a right to terminate the employee before they went on the trip. That does not apply in every court in this country, but it applies in a number of them. And of course, the EEOC is on the other side of that. The EEOC believes that that's improper. But yet, if you follow the EEOC's view, it's a real question of, all right, well, if we don't want to terminate them, what do we do? That is a real question that needs to be worked through. Recall also that the CDC has issued a level 2 travel notice for all international travel, advising high-risk travelers to take precautions while traveling or considering postponing the trip altogether. So, for example, if you have certain employees who are in a high-risk category, even in the areas where they might otherwise be able to go, but for the that they would be able to go because they're outside of the ban, you still want to stay away from that. And listening to Dr. Drucker's presentation at the beginning of this, it sounds like that admonition is going to grow. We'll have to see. Other large questions that we've received: if your employees travel to affected areas, and let's say you have somebody who's been in an affected area, now they want to come back, and they can come back. They're a U.S. citizen, and they're going to be, first of all, they're going to be quarantined under the presidential ban, but you can also require them to self-quarantine for a period of time. You need not wait until the employee returns from travel in order to ask them whether they are suffering any of the symptoms from the virus. Remember that the ADA and other restrictions on what you can ask are still intact, meaning that you have to make sure that your inquiry is tied to potential harm that they may cause in the workplace. And this is not an exercise of curiosity. Make sure we're on that next slide. What if one of your employees is diagnosed with the virus? The steps that we've seen so far and that we've learned employers are wisely taking is, first, they quickly are informing their other employees about the potential workplace contamination. They're sending the contaminated employee home. There's some issues there because there's a question of whether they're going home. A healthcare provider can provide the identity of the contaminated employee to others on a need-to-know basis. That is an area where you have to be careful because of HIPAA concerns. But if it's for the purpose of protecting other employees at the workplace, that has to be carefully messaged. It should really go through your internal healthcare provider. Maybe you have someone who is on your medical staff, for example. But that's something we advise you to reach out to your counsel about, to make sure you're doing it the right way. Remember that when we talk about individual rights, there are employee leave laws that do apply here. So, for example, the Family Medical Leave Act, for the contaminated employee or for employees to care for family members who are contaminated is still intact. And we'll talk for just a second about the Families First bill, which is not yet law. The ADA, of course, prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability. It has similar protections as Title VII. It requires employers to provide a reasonable accommodation to employees with disabilities, barring undue hardship. For example, if an employee asks for a certain amount of leave from the job, your workplace is still open, it has to stay open, but then an employee asks for leave as a reasonable accommodation. That's something that should be considered if it will help them perform at some point soon the essential functions of the job. And that's again something to walk through very carefully. Remember that when you're talking about the ADA, it applies to employers who have 15 or more employees. When you talk about the FMLA, it applies to employers who have 50 or more employees. I mean, not every employee is entitled to FMLA. Just talking very briefly about the Families First bill. So the Families First bill passed the House, as you probably saw on, I guess it was Friday. Folks are looking very carefully at the Senate as to whether the Senate is going to pass it as well, and then the president has indicated it will become law. Now, this applies probably to a number of you on the call. It applies to employers with fewer than 500 employees. And it expires at the end of this year. It is purely intended to deal with the coronavirus. And what it does is it amends the FMLA on a temporary basis, where it adjusts the eligibility standards. So, for example, under the normal FMLA, an employee needs to work for 1,250 hours during the previous 12-month period in order to be eligible. But in the Families First bill, the employee merely needs to work 30 days for the employer in order to be eligible for it. Literally somebody who you would have just hired. It also, this bill also provides 12 weeks of job protected family medical leave. The first 14 days of that leave are unpaid. And then after the 14 days, the remainder, 2/3 of the employee's pay should be provided. Remember too, we're only talking about federal. State is a different thing and may require additional protections. Under the Families First bill, the triggers for it. Your employee has a close relative who is quarantined, or a child who's home from school because schools have closed. Those themselves are now reasons that the employee can use this Families First medical leave. And then, of course, the bill also provides $1 billion to states for unemployment insurance, where as long as states relax certain unemployment eligibility requirements. And just kind of wrapping this up, on this last slide, other workforce considerations. Couple of things to think about. You heard Alex mention on stop work and what that means for government contractors. As you know, that on one hand you have an obligation to be able to start operations when the government needs. What you do with your employees during that time period is a very difficult question. Again, one that you probably want to reach out to some of your internal and external experts to talk about. What do you do when you have a CBA that's in place, or a collective bargaining agreement? There are going to be certain things in that agreement that pertain to policies that you might want to put in place that are caused by an emergency. If your management rights clause is broad enough, then you can take that action if it needs to happen on an emergency basis, understanding that you will later need to turn to that action and bargain with the union over it as to whether it becomes a more permanent solution. The WARN Act here applies as well. I hope that no one has to face this. But of course, the Federal WARN Act requires employers to provide 60 days advance notice to covered employees, unions, and government officials prior to a plant closing or mass layoff at a single site of employment. And there are state miniature versions of that as well. Now, a plant closing under the WARN Act, just wrapping this up, is defined as 50 or more accountable employment losses at a single site of employment in a 90-day period that results from ceasing operations in one or more operating units. This is the kind of stuff, by the way, that, unfortunately our economy may see this summer and this fall at the end of dealing with the virus. A mass layoff itself is defined as 50 or more countable employment losses at a single site as well. So just keep in mind that if you have to, unfortunately, effect a layoff, it's also an area where you should walk carefully. There are certain requirements here, both on the federal and state level, in order to make sure that you do this the right way. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jorge and look forward to questions at the end.
Great. Thank you very much, Preston. And I know that we're kind of at the hour mark, so I'll need to be brief so we can leave questions and answer your questions. So I'm going to cover tax issues from two perspectives. One is what's happening in Congress, which is very active these days, and also what's happening at the IRS, and also highlight a few issues that you may be considering and thinking about in this ever fluid situation as we speak. So as Preston hinted, Saturday morning, the House and Congress passed the Family First Coronavirus Bill. It passed really early in the morning. The Senate is expected to act on it soon. Although the latest that we're hearing is that the House is going to have to pass it again due to some technical issues with the language affecting the railroad sector. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But generally speaking, the main tax provision is that the bill provides a payroll tax credit for paid sick and paid family and medical leave, wages paid by employers with employees less than 500. And there's kind of a back and forth within practitioners on those limits, but I think the general understanding is that only for employers with less than 500 employees. And also that credit applies to those self-employed individuals as well. So that's the latest provision right now, and that could shift as the Senate considers the bill today and this week. That provision could expand. So I encourage you all to kind of take a look at that for those that could qualify for the payroll tax credits. This is different than the more broader payroll tax credit discussion that's currently ongoing. Also, Congress, I mentioned kind of this is the first coronavirus bill that Congress is considering. There is growing momentum for Congress to consider a much larger tax cut relief legislation in the near term. I think as soon as Congress passes this bill this week, we hope they're going to get to work on a larger package that's going to broadly impact a number of sectors, potentially your sector as well. And that's something to watch out for. I'll talk a little bit in a second about what that could look like. Also, at the IRS, what are they currently considering? There was a letter from the president Friday to the Treasury Secretary and a number of other cabinet secretaries, basically mandating them to extend any and all deadlines where taxpayers had been adversely affected by the coronavirus. That kind of was open-ended, didn't really get into the details of what that meant, who is adversely affected. As Erin hinted at already, IRS has issued a little guidance already as to some of the interplay on some of the health provisions. But that's, I think the conventional wisdom is that the IRS is going to be a lot more lenient when it comes to penalties and deadlines that they are encountering. For example, there's a deadline today for partnerships and S corporations to file. Then that's, I think the thought is that the IRS is going to be more lenient for those who will not be able to meet that deadline. Then there's a broader question of what happens on April 15th, tax filing deadline. There's a lot of discussion by from the president and others about whether the April 15th tax deadline will be extended. As of now, there has not been firm guidance from the IRS on this. So the expectation, obviously, is that April 15th is continuing to stay in place. And I think our advice to all taxpayers would be to assume as of April 15th will continue to stick. If you can go to the next slide, please, Alex. So then I'll kind of talk a little bit about kind of issues that you are potentially facing. And this obviously is a broad topic, and it's hard to kind of think of every little example that you may be facing. But I think one issue that we are studying more and more is losses, right? Obviously, your companies are probably going to experience a significant amount of losses due to the coronavirus and the standstill currently that's taking place due to what's happening. And I think just a couple of things just to kind of leave for you is that the most recent major tax bill, the 2017 tax law changes, which was pretty broad, actually made some pretty significant changes to how losses are treated. And particularly, obviously when you have a loss, those can turn into tax positives and tax benefits. And that's what the tax law changed and actually curtailed a lot of the ability to use those losses. Front and center is the 2017 tax law put a limit on the amount of losses you can carry back for past years. So before 2017, right, for many years, if you experience a significant amount of losses that you could not use on an existing year, a taxpayer was allowed to carry that back to past years where you perhaps were not in a loss position, therefore allowing you to have a refund. So carrying back those losses. That was eliminated by the 2017 tax law. And that's something that I think has not been discussed enough. And but obviously because of this current economic state, you're going to find a lot of those companies finding that out pretty fast. Also, there are restrictions to the amount of losses one can take in a particular year due to the income limitations as well. And also there's a limit as to how much losses one can, a taxpayer, a company can also carry forward as well. And that's something to keep in mind for all of you as you kind of work with your accounting team and try to calculate those losses. Also, there's the interplay between losses and tax deductions, right? So, there are many tax deductions in the tax code, significant new ones from 2017 tax law for those companies from the U.S. operating abroad. And there's there's an interplay that we're hearing a lot about, losses, losses limiting the amount of deductions one can take in other areas internationally. There's a Section 250 deduction and others, and I think that's something just to keep in mind is that as you book your losses, keep it in mind how you could be permanently hampering the ability to take certain tax deductions that normally would be allowed to you. So that's something to keep in mind for you all. And then let me just close, and then we can go to questions on kind of the outlook for this year. And I'll start kind of with the IRS, right? I think the IRS, you have to act under the assumption that the IRS will not extend as many deadlines as we think, right? Until we hear definitively from the IRS, particularly April 15th. I think that should be conventional wisdom, obviously keeping a close line of communication with the IRS on any number of issues that you could be facing would be important. A question that is evolving and we're getting a lot about is obviously audits, right? And obviously audits are going to be ongoing, right? The IRS isn't just shutting down. And typically there are, auditors at the IRS that have very strict timelines as to how they want to conclude an audit. And then there are items that are going to be asked of you by the IRS, right? So there's keeping in mind that an auditor could have a little more leniency on those deadlines and timelines. I think it's something to keep in mind. The second piece, what's happening in Congress, I think is important to keep in mind because this tax bill that we've been talking about today will not be the only one, and there's a significant, as I mentioned earlier, significant momentum for Congress to pass a more robust tax package aimed at injecting cash to impacted sectors. Obviously, the broader discussion about a broader payroll tax cuts, expanding charitable tax deductions, how to address that issue of losses that we just talked about. I think when Congress passed the Recovery Act in light of the Great Recession back in 2008, there was a lot of expansion in the ability to use those losses like a carryback. So I am hopeful, and I suspect very highly that Congress is going to grapple with those issues for impacted sectors. I think with the one nugget I would leave with all of you is that keeping in mind that Congress is going to want to address all sectors impacted negatively by the coronavirus. I think being engaged with Congress will be extremely important. Obviously, Congress won't know of your problems unless you kind of go to them. So I think that's something that we would advise you strongly to kind of think through what issues impacting your sector that are not addressed currently in the tax code that problems that you foresee in the future. So I think thinking through that very carefully and something that obviously that we do day in and day out. I think it's something that's imperative. As I mentioned earlier, that the payroll tax credit right now for sick leave and family and medical leave. There's a quirk right now in the current tax impacting the railroad tax sector, and Congress is poised to address that. So I leave that with you as a nugget to stay engaged. So I'll pause there and give it back to you, Alex.
Sure thing. And hopefully everybody can see the chat function on the toolbar I see it at the top of my screen. But if there are any questions, if you click on that little, it looks like a comment bubble, you're able to submit questions through that medium, and we'll give that a minute to see if folks want to have any questions. And if not, we can then open it up to any questions for folks who are on the phone. We'll do that second. So just give it a minute here. Okay, seeing no, Larry, I'm not sure if you're seeing any questions coming through the chat, but if there's anyone on the phone who has any questions they want to ask, try to do that as orderly as possible.
I have not seen any questions yet. I'm going to go ahead and manually unmute the people who are dialed in so they make it a little bit easier for them. And if anyone else wants to unmute themselves and ask a question, please feel free.
Yeah, this is Tom Lampley with KBR. Quick question as to whether anybody's been hearing anything at all about any relief of the Fly America Act in terms of getting people deployed forward into countries. Is there any discussion been held on that?
I haven't heard anything directly with the Flight America Act, but I do know that there is a lot of discussion about providing relief, tax and non-tax for the airline sector, whether, cash infusion, loans, for the aviation sector.
Yeah, Tom, on the government contracts side, I have not heard about any waivers of Fly American up until this point. There may be folks on the phone who are hearing different on their particular programs, but in terms of a blanket waiver, certainly that's not something that has come up yet. But it's a good question, because I think, in some ways, these are the types of questions that you maybe want the people on the phone maybe want to pose to their customers, right? And try to figure out if there's a way to ensure, continued performance. If waiving Fly America is the way to do that, or a way to do that, I would think your customers would be hopefully all ears on that one.
Hey, Alex, this is Howie Lynn. Question for Dr. Druckman. Is Dr. Druckman still on?
Yep, still here.
Okay. You mentioned during your remarks about the, several months of, we'd have to put up with this. Is there any kind of track record so far from other countries, a rough timeline of start to finish that they've experienced that we could kind of use as a ballpark for us?
Well, I think it is evolving. I mean, everyone's looking at is China, right? I mean, that's where it started. So they were hit first, and how close are they getting to recovering? They're probably not that far away. Actually, if you look at some of the data, and we're hoping to publish this week, everyone's kind of looking at the cumulative cases. Like there's 90,000, 80,000, 100,000 cases in China, but that's not the real number to look at. What you want to look at is that number subtracted from the people who've recovered and the people who have unfortunately died. And that will tell you how many actual current cases they have today, right? And that's the real number I think you want to look at. So if the current number of cases is dropping significantly, then you're starting to see the end of that wave in China. But literally, this started probably sometime in December. You've got January, February, March, so we're already 3 months in, and it's not finished in a lot of places there yet. So I think that would be probably, and the other challenge, the other interesting kind of almost paradox is that the assumption is that if we're really aggressive in controlling and mitigating this, the quote wave, it means that it's going to be drawn out for a longer period of time. So if it's really bad, it might be shorter. If we're really good, it could be longer. So I would suspect, you're probably looking at the 3 to 4 or 5 month range.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Druckman, we had another one come in through the chat. It says during Spanish flu, we had 2 to 3 waves of flu through the United States. Should we expect something similar? Also different evolutions of the same virus?
Yeah, it's a great question. So yeah, I mean, that's still a big outstanding question that no one really knows whether this is going to be a one-time deal and then it disappears, or whether it becomes a seasonal thing, Coronaviruses generally don't like warm weather, but that's kind of being refuted because it's happening in Australia and Singapore where it's still pretty warm. But yeah, so we don't know whether there's going to be multiple waves. We're going to be expecting and planning, I would assume, for multiple waves, and hoping that they don't come. And that really the purpose ultimately is to try to mitigate and control these waves until we have a vaccine. So once we have the vaccine, then we all get vaccinated, then hopefully we don't have to worry too much about it. But until then, we're kind of exposed. And we're also not quite sure, if you've had the disease, whether you're immune or not to it, or whether you might have a second infection. There's some question about whether people might get second infection. So there's still a lot of things that are unknown, but I would suspect the prudent thing to do is once this wave is over, everyone's gearing up and learning from what we learned from the first wave, and hopefully no wave will come, but if it does, we're better prepared for the second one.
Okay, the second part to that question, both of these come from Doug Brooks. He asks if there have been any evolutions of the existing virus, or if we expect to see any evolutions of this virus.
You mean is it mutated or changed? Yeah, so the virus is much different than flu viruses. Flu viruses, they mutate much more regularly and commonly. Coronaviruses don't, apparently. But again, this is all the research that's being done right now to see, is the virus slightly different in one place than another? And so that research is still waiting to come in.
Doctor, this is Preston Pugh. I just had a question on those lines for you. I read in the South China Morning Post that the quarantining people was actually causing the effects of the virus to show up later, right? So whereas maybe at the beginning before quarantine happens, people would show signs right away, but once they did quarantine, the signs showed more towards that 5th or 6th day. Is there any truth in that?
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't heard that. The average, what they call incubation period, is like 5 or 6 days. And then, it can be as early as 2 days and as late, as 14 days, 10 to 14 days. That's why we use the 14-day number, because we just want to try to catch all the possible potential cases from the last exposure. But yeah, look, I mean, it's again, all that data is still being collated. It's a bit tricky because, the clock starts from that last contact. So you really need to know from the individual when was your last contact with that case, and then you're no longer, and then you have to be isolated from that point on. So you couldn't have had another contact in between that last contact. So you can imagine how it can be a little tricky to figure out exactly what the real incubation period is.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? Okay, well, with that, Howie, do you want to maybe just wrap us up here?
Well, I'll just say thank you to you, Alex, and to your company, Miller Chevalier, and to International SOS, both for putting this on and all the expertise that was involved here. We appreciate it very much. So with that, you have anything else to add to that before we sign off?
No, just thank you to everybody, and hopefully the technology cooperated okay.
That's right. Okay, thank you everybody for calling in.
Yep. Take care.
Thank you.
All right.